Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. We do so by painting an accurate picture of that journey from the perspective of the justice-involved individual. Too often, our perceptions of those individuals are tainted by media-driven caricatures created to sell newspapers or movie tickets. This adds little to a healthy dialogue as to how to best address criminality and the reintegration process. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please, welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 83 of the Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. As longtime listeners of this show are aware, we enjoy bridging the gap, if you will, between the more established risk, need, responsivity framework and that of the emerging desistance approaches, with as much as we can cover in between, such as trauma-informed practices. However, one thing that often gets lost in the shuffle is implementation science. Whether your agency is adopting an R&R framework, a desistance framework, a good lives model, regardless of the model, if we don't adhere to sound implementation science, our efforts are more often than not muted. Which is why I am so glad to be talking today with Dr. Alex Walker, one of our friends from ACJI out in Colorado. That's the Alliance for Community and Justice Innovation. I first met Alex a few years back when I traveled to Colorado to attend their Implementation and Leadership Academy. Dr. Walker is an experienced criminal justice professional with a demonstrated history of working in reentry, corrections, and of course, reform. She is skilled in public speaking, training, coaching, leadership development, community corrections, substance use disorders, mental health, and also crisis intervention. Alex attained her master's degree from John Jay College of Criminal Justice and earned her PhD from Colorado State University, focusing on sociology. Her dissertation was entitled Dosage Matters: The Role of Community Corrections Interventions on Client Recidivism. Please enjoy my conversation with my friend and mentor, Dr. Alex Walker, and I will see you all on the other side. Well, welcome to the show, Alex. So glad to have you here. Why don't we start out by you telling us a little bit about yourself, your background, both educationally, professionally, vocationally, just to kind of share with our listeners your journey of how you got to where you're at now.
Well, thanks for having me, Joe. I'm really excited to be here. You know, personally, I have kind of an interesting background where I have husband and kids and my parents, and we all live on this little farmette. So something people don't often know about me is that we live in the middle of semi-nowhere and have lots of animals. So at any given time, we have dogs and cats and chickens and sometimes pigs and cows. And right now we have 68 fire mitigation goats, which is completely random. But that keeps me busy in my spare time. Professionally, though, I've had just a ton of opportunities. I have said yes to everything I can imagine throughout my career, and it's really been exciting. So I started out in the mental health space and really thought I wanted to be a clinician. I was working with juveniles or youth, and it was a really great learning space of all the different things that kind of all the collateral consequences that get in the way and help set up the situation where people are struggling and needing some support. And so I did an undergrad in human services, wanted to be a clinician. So I moved to New York City and went to John Jay, which was just an incredible experience. And there I had the opportunity to work at Rikers Island. And I was a clinician there, assessing people for restrictive housing. And I saw some things that I have never seen since. I also did some volunteer work with gang outreach in the Bronx and did some harm reduction work out there. So it was just a tremendous experience, and it opened up my eyes to all the different things that are going on in the justice space and how there's really tremendous opportunity to get involved across the spectrum. When I came back to Colorado after that experience, I did some adjunct teaching, which I've always enjoyed, and worked with law enforcement. That work kind of started in New York, where we were training crisis intervention work with law enforcement, and that spilled over back over here. But where I found kind of my love was in the reentry space. So working with adults who are either trying to avoid going to prison or coming out of prison, and really thinking about how our systems come together and integrate in a way that sets people up for success, because traditionally we have created some pretty big barriers that are often unintentional. And so that's been a really piece of passion for me in my work, is how can we do this better? How can we serve people better? How can we create systems that function a little bit better? And my passion for kind of program implementation and addressing those barriers and really thinking about alignment stemmed from that work. And it led me to pursue a PhD that took me a decade. It took a long time. But I know that you're a fan of the dosage literature, and I wanted to work on expanding some of that, and have had just a number of experiences in different spaces and places within the reentry world that have led me to really go all in on implementation and alignment work in the system.
Which is much needed work indeed. This led you in 2016 to launch the Alliance for Community and Justice Innovation. What inspired you to make that leap of faith, if you will, with you and your awesome colleagues?
You know, it came from a few decades of banging my head against the wall. And I have 3 colleagues who make up ACJI with me who are incredibly talented, smart folks. And we came together actually in my basement and said, what are we missing? Why do we keep recycling good ideas, trying things again? Every 5 to 7 years, we were kind of seeing the same stuff pop up, and we would try again. And why do we keep having these efforts fizzle and fade despite tremendous effort and energy? I mean, I've been in this field long enough to know there are so many well-intentioned, dedicated, passionate people working really hard that our outcomes are kind of offensive, that, you know, we're not really being as helpful as we had hoped. And so we came together to say, what do we wish we would have known 20 years ago? And really what comes up every single time is we did not understand the science of implementation. We did not understand how to make change in these huge systems in a way that would stick and not fizzle and fade. And so ultimately, when I saw the policy, practice, and process roadblocks that were at play kind of every single day in our system, and I watched gatekeepers throughout the system with really good intentions orchestrate failure, it was really painful to watch folks who are well-intentioned trying really hard just kind of create these situations where these initiatives could never stick and never really bring about the true outcomes and impacts that we were hoping for. And so implementation and alignment has become a bit of our mission, and it's a really important piece of the work that we haven't been talking about.
So to that end, so you and I first met initially when I came out to Denver to participate in your 3-day implementation leadership academy. Mm-hmm. What are administrators missing? Why is implementation leadership so important? Again, despite our best efforts around learning about evidence-based practices, what are we missing with that implementation piece that you see from your experience?
Well, how long do you have, Joe? That's a big question. But what I would say, if you had to boil it all down, most of us were raised up in this field, trained, studied, learned traditional change management strategies. And when we manage change, we are managing ourselves to stay within our status quo. And so a lot of the initiatives that we're trying to do, the shift that we're trying to make in this space, requires us to truly change the way that we've done business. And so I think change leadership is really what we wanted to bring to the field, was how can you lead change instead of trying to micromanage change in a way that keeps you just a little bit outside of your comfort zone. Change leadership really requires getting clear about your vision and doubling down on that vision and really aligning around all of that work. And it's a different skill set, and it makes people really uncomfortable. And as you know, there's lots of tools and things that you can learn about that you say, okay, this now makes more sense to me. But we're not trained to do that work. We're actually trained to do the management side of things. And these initiatives, as we kind of shift philosophies or try to integrate philosophies in the justice system around, are we correctional? Are we rehabilitative? Are we looking for deterrence or incapacitation or retribution? When we try to think about all the things that we're tasked to do in this space, implementation is really about significant change that has socially significant outcomes. And that requires us to step outside of our comfort zone and do things differently.
So many fun little nuggets of information that I've picked up from you and your team over the years, such as things like addressing adaptive problems with technical solutions. Mm-hmm. I know ACJI has crafted their 10 essential principles of implementation leadership. Not going to ask you to review each and every one of those, but if we could maybe get some highlights from those, starting with one that I think most folks can really relate to, if not outright see every day. And that's this notion that culture is king. Maybe talk about that principle to begin with.
Absolutely. And so for what it's worth, we did publish an article in Federal Probation that highlights all the 10 principles. If anyone's interested, I can send it to you so you can share. But culture is king is such an important piece of this work. And I like to think about it as two different types of culture. Culture's happening whether you're intentional about it or not. So if you're not talking about it and working on it, it's happening anyway. And it is likely getting in the way of different initiatives that you're trying to pursue. And so when we think about organizational culture, traditional justice entities are really kind of prescriptive. They're policy driven. They're focused on doing the same thing over and over and over again, making sure that it's consistent. And those are things that get in the way of change. So it doesn't mean those organizations can't change. It means they have to work harder to be able to fight the urge to write a policy about ideas before they've fully vetted them. And to try things and think about failure as learning. So some of our organizational structure types kind of get in the way of implementation just by very nature of how we've set them up. I know that one of your favorite sayings is the best way to kill an idea is to develop a policy and procedure.
Yes.
And that is very true. That is part of our struggle in this space. And so when you have that as your foundational structure, implementation is always going to be challenging. And even the best strategy, the most resources, lots of people and money and things, culture is going to eat that strategy for breakfast. And so you have to be thinking about how your organizational structure might be getting in the way. I think the other piece, though, is this relational culture. So when you think about what's happening at the water cooler, what are people talking about, what's going on in the meeting after the meeting, oftentimes our best strategies are being unraveled without us ever knowing it, because the relational culture is really about the people and their habits, which we are creatures of habit. We don't really like to change personally, never mind organizationally. So our habits, and then what we believe and what we think is important, and the mindset that we show up with at work comes together and turns into what we talk about with each other and how we interact with each other. And those are some of the cultural habits that are really tough to break when you don't kind of take culture out of the abstract and plunk it right on the table and start talking about what is our culture and how might it be getting in the way of the work that we're trying to do.
And I wonder, too, if that's just a struggle for agencies and administrations because it almost involves an ownership of, that's our culture. And that's just not a comfortable conversation or realization that folks want to have. I will leave a link in the episode description of this show for that federal probation article that you mentioned. Okay. So folks can just access that right there to see those 10 essential principles of implementation leadership. We mentioned the one, culture is king. Is there another one that you can maybe leave as a sort of teaser to direct folks to check out all 10 of those strategies?
Well, you mentioned technical solutions to adaptive problems. And so when I think about two principles that come together to form a really powerful message, we have fail forward, fail often, and adapt or die. And so one of the things that we've struggled with traditionally in this space is really looking at failure as learning. Most people are pretty afraid of making mistakes in this space because it can really be detrimental for all sorts of folks. However, there are some opportunities to try things out and to learn in low stakes environments so that we can figure out what works, because every agency is different, their work is different, the vision for the future might be different. And so getting clear about where we're headed and then creating some opportunities to try things out before we create the policy, before we go all in on prescriptive behaviors, can go a long way to helping include people, make sure we're engaging stakeholders. The other piece is that adapt or die, how we solve problems really can either solve the problems for real or create more problems for us. And so most of our technical problems, the things that are easy to identify, that take an act of authority to fix and can be fixed relatively quickly, those can be delegated. Those are a simple yes. Those are the things that you can take off your plate. And what we need to be focused on as leaders of change is the adaptive problems, which are people problems. They're the things that require you to change your mindset, your beliefs, your attitudes, how you structure your day and your habits. And those are much harder to shift. And there's no clear answer. There's no prescription for an adaptive problem. You have to be willing to try. And that's why fail forward, fail often is really involved in that, because you have to tinker with it. If left unaddressed, though, those adaptive problems become what I call historical baggage that is really tough to overcome. I mean, we talk to agencies all the time their staff are expressing feelings of situations that happened 15 years ago when they weren't even there, but they talk about it as if they experienced it themselves. That's historical baggage, unaddressed adaptive problems. And adaptive problems are tricky to solve. And if you just throw technical solutions like, well, here's a new policy, so we'll force people to change how they think, those types of things just create more problems. And so at ACJI, our team is really focused on helping people to diagnose the problems that they're seeing, figure out which pieces are technical and can be dealt with, and how to structure some experiments, some things that you can try to address those adaptive, often people and cultural problems that are going on, that are getting in the way. And they always exist. They're always there.
When you were sharing with our audience your journey as to how you got where you are now, I learned a couple of interesting things, but I want to go back a little bit. Let's talk about the fact that you were a member of the Colorado Parole Board from 2015 to 2019. What was that experience like?
It was probably the most unique experience I've ever had. So funny story, Joe, when I was 18 and someone asked me, what do you want to do? Like, what's your end game goal? I was an intern at that time in the justice space working with youth. I said, I want to be on the parole board. I want to be the chair of the parole board one day. I had no idea what that meant. I had no idea what that work entailed. But it was a fascinating experience of really having to be insightful and reflect on my own stuff and how that was coming out, because we were just making decisions all day long, and you can quickly see how your personal biases pop up in different weird ways. And so it was a really difficult job from that sense. And I'll just be honest with you, and I think the research backs me up here, as humans, we're terrible decision makers. And so it was really uncomfortable to know whether or not you were making the right decision. And there's really no way, if you deny somebody parole, there's no way to know if that was a good decision or not. And so it's just a strange space. Some of the work that I really appreciated in that was a focus on developing structured decision-making tools to help make sure, that story of it depends on which board member you get is what outcome you might get was really heartbreaking. And so focusing on structured decision-making tools was a way to at least bring everyone to the same starting place. And then the decisions went from there. But I have to tell you, Joe, Dr. Ed Ryan from Robina Institute and another colleague of mine, we wrote an article a couple of years ago called Awaking the Sleeping Giant. And I actually think the benefit of a parole board has nothing to do with those decisions. I think the parole board is one of the only places where you can see what's happening in the day-to-day and you're sitting at the policy table at the same time. And so when people say, what's actually happening in practice, your parole board knows. They see all the barriers, all the things that fall through the gaps, all the ways that what we think is happening because of legislation or policy or whatever we've asked people to do is not happening in practice. And so I believe the parole board is actually a feedback mechanism for governors and different policy leaders and heads to say, did we actually have an impact here? Because a lot of times well-intentioned legislation and policy changes actually create a ton of problems on the ground level. And I don't think anyone's asking. I think the parole board is best kept on the side. No one really wants to talk or deal with that kind of stuff. And I think their true value is as a feedback mechanism to say, here's what's actually happening on the ground and how different that might be from what you think is happening because of policy. What do you think about that, Joe?
I love that reframe, that it's the ultimate feedback mechanism. I know you and I have chatted quite a bit offline about a variety of topics, but one of the things that I always bring up is the trend that we don't really lean into the data as much as we should, unfortunately, in not just criminal justice, I would contend particularly in corrections. And so it almost gives license for the practitioner just to sort of freelance, if you will, or do their thing, because there's no, like you said, there's not that feedback loop. We're not really, again, in my opinion, leveraging recidivism data, outcome data. And again, I think it feeds this culture of, well, says you, Joe, says you, Alex. Well, I can show you, though, with this feedback or with this data, and more than just simply butts in the seats for a cognitive group, but again, actual data and deliverables to show what we're doing is working, not working, or needs to be adjusted. So whenever I hear feedback loop, I love it.
Yeah, it's a missed opportunity, I would say. I mean, no matter how you feel about parole boards, having somebody who has that experience, and we were making 24-ish decisions individually a day, and then we would do full boards. It was like 80 or 90 decisions in a day, just tremendous amounts of exposure to what's actually happening on the ground. And no one ever asked. No one ever said, hey, we did this thing. Did it work? Is it happening in practice? And there would be lots of stories about anecdotes and what people were feeling about what was happening. But at the end of the day, we were able to see in real time whether or not it was having an impact. And we were also at the policy table, but not in a way that people wanted the feedback, because feedback's kind of scary. The other thing I would say to your comment, Joe, is we're not doing a great job with data. And sometimes that's because we don't have it, or we don't know what to look for. Most of the time, we're data saturated. We have so much data, we don't even know what it's telling us and where to start. And so I think a really important piece about all of this work is getting clear on what's our purpose, where are we headed. I talk a lot about something called the why triangle in the academy, but just really aligning where we're going and what our purpose is with what we ask people to do and what we identify as those high impact strategies, and then connecting that to the why of people's work. Without it, we just have a bunch of data points that tell us aren't clear enough to really give us a direction. So we just get lost in it, and oftentimes we forget about it because there's too much of it and we don't know how to use it.
And to your point, I think and this probably has to do more with how the vocation is sort of evolving, but to your point, you could probably get 10 probation officers in a room and ask them what their definition of success is and get 10 different answers. So then, again, to your point about the data points, we're not even agreeing on what success looks like.
You're so correct on that. You can ask, everyone will have their own definition. It's unclear from leadership often. Most of the time, people associate, what I hear is people associate no news is good news. If I'm not in the news and if I'm not in trouble, I must be doing a good job. We can do better than that. We have to do better than that. And I know that's not true for everybody, but we hear that a lot. And I think it's because some of the nature of how our systems work, we have lots of leadership changes. Unfortunately, pendulum swings are not uncommon for us when sentinel or serious situations happen. Colorado is, we've been through some stuff ourselves. So some of that also contributes to this, we don't know where we're headed. And so we don't know what success looks like because we don't have a clear path.
The next question is one that I ask to most or many of my guests, whether they're practitioners, administrators, academics, researchers, or in particular, individuals with lived experience. But what is one piece of advice, Alex, that you would give to a director of a corrections agency who is struggling with implementing their evidence-based practices? Maybe sort of just a 30,000, what would the elevator speech look like if you were trapped in that elevator with somebody who, again, very well-intentioned, but really struggling?
Well, Joe, I'm a talker, so picking one thing is hard, but I appreciate you making me focus. I'm going to do my best to combine multiple things into one statement.
Please do.
I would say if everything's important, nothing is important. And so if you are struggling, chances are you're trying to do a million different things, many of which are probably contradictory. And what I would recommend is sit somewhere quiet or work with someone that can be a good sounding board and get clear on where do I want to be 5 years from now? And what are 2 or 3, and I'm serious about this, 2 or 3 high impact strategies. If I did nothing else, if my staff did nothing else, what are those 2 or 3 high impact strategies that would get us there? And then align. Just start looking at everything. Does this thing that I just did today match where I'm trying to go and what my high impact strategies are? And if it doesn't, do your best to either get rid of it altogether or deprioritize it. I think we spend a lot of time doing things that are not aligned with where we're trying to go.
Yeah, as you spoke, that reminded me of a recent interview I had with our mutual acquaintance, Brad Bogue, in your home state of Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
Love Brad.
We talked about, he was talking about the difficulty with folks sort of operationalizing the needs principle. And he was saying, let's just focus on maybe attitudes and companions. And to your point, just be laser focused on a couple of things. He called it the hedgehog principle. The reason the hedgehog has survived for so many millennia, it's good at one thing. It's good at rolling up in a ball and hiding underground. And so he was saying, maybe we can get around some of this operationalizing or implementation issues, again, by just adopting more of the hedgehog principle. And I've seen this, and I know you have too, with agencies that they're well-intentioned, but they want to take on so much, but it just puts so much on the plate of the practitioner and or larger on the agency that it's just too much of a smorgasbord of change for folks to adopt to. Yeah.
It's really confusing because we layer stuff on top of each other. We don't ever take things off of people's plates. And a lot of the things that we're asking people to do in a given day contradict one another, or we haven't done a good job of communicating how they're integrated and how they can complement one another. And so people are just confused and feel like, well, I just have to check these boxes and then I'm okay, as opposed to really understanding how do these concepts fit together? How do these tasks come together? Why are we doing this thing that we're doing? And what I would say, my lovely colleague, brilliant colleague Johanna says often, there's no shortage of good ideas. And there isn't. You will always have new, shiny, great ideas that sound great. And if you can be clear about where you're trying to go and what your highest impact strategies are, then it becomes a lens to say, does this great sounding, shiny idea get us there or not? And if it doesn't, then say, that's a great idea and we're not going to do it. If it does get you there, if it does align, then you have some support to maybe move forward with this. But every shiny idea in one agency just creates confusion and culture problems.
Yeah, I'm thinking, as you know, I'm a big proponent of the risk, need, responsivity framework. Mm-hmm. So a lot of agencies have done a good job unpacking more of the responsivity principle, in particular specific responsivity. But to your point, we're now looking at legitimate change targets around, say, for example, mental health, the impact of trauma, all of the literature around ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Yeah. But without the proper context that, okay, but these are all falling within responsivity, we could have practitioners, or I would contend even administrators, going too far in on any one of these new initiatives, whether it's trauma, whether it's mental health, whether it's whatnot. But again, they're not seeing it within the larger constellation of what we're trying to do within risk, need, responsivity. And to your point, how that gets the client to the finish line. It's a priority issue, and if not an outright communication issue as well.
Yeah, one of the things that I've seen the community be able to do really well is leverage each other so that they don't have to be all things to all people, but really doubling down on what is part of their vision and what they're really trying to tackle from high impact strategy perspective, and then connecting with other community partners so that they're creating a network. Because at the end of the day, our purpose here is to really engage community support, to create communities for people that can do this work and support folks in the long term. None of us want for people to stay in the system forever. That's, the opposite of what we're hoping for. And so when we can get really good at creating our foundation, getting clear on what are we good at and how can we do that, use that as a foundation, and then leverage all the other people who are good at other things. I think there's a real opportunity to not feel compelled to do it all, because again, when everything's important, nothing's important. And I feel like that's why our outcomes are where they're at, because we've tried to be everything to everyone, and it just gets really messy.
Mm-hmm. I should make it clear for our listeners that ACJI and your services are not limited to corrections professionals. I want to throw that out. You do fantastic implementation work with other vocations. That being said, we do have a healthy background here with risk, need, responsivity in that model. However, long-term listeners of the show will know we also speak quite a bit on the program as to the emerging desistance approaches. So the next horizon here, what might that conversion, if you will, look like for an agency who, again, is in a good spot with risk, need, responsivity, but they're seeing some stuff coming out of the United Kingdom or other agencies, and they've heard this term desistance out there. What are your thoughts on this sort of Coke Pepsi approach coexisting?
So I love the direction that we're headed just in general. Thinking through strength-based approaches and desistance approaches. I even love this movement in the community to go to strength assessments as opposed, let risk be the kind of traditional system stuff, and really focus in on what are people's strengths and how do we leverage that? Because often we think of strengths and then we just say, well, it's a strength, so I don't have to deal with it, as opposed to really leveraging strengths to help people get out of the system and stay out of the system. And so I feel a bit like a broken record here, Joe, but I do think that anytime you're trying to create a conversion, what you're really trying to do is integrate philosophies, and that requires getting very clear on what are we trying to accomplish here? What pieces and parts of these things fit in where we're trying to go? And then how can we get really clear on the highest impact strategies within those models, how can we articulate and communicate how those things fit together? Because that's where a lot of confusion comes from. If you think about the age-old challenge in our correctional field about kind of traditional law enforcement strategies versus behavior change strategies, we haven't done a great job talking to people about how it's not either or, it's how do they come together? And people are really confused about when those things are supposed to be put into place and how they work together. People often feel and express, I have to choose one. I'm really good at one or the other. And there's a real opportunity to integrate these things. And so I think just like that, there's an opportunity here to take the best pieces for what fits with what you're trying to do and really start aligning around the practices and ideas that are best suited for what you're trying to accomplish. Because every organization is so different, it takes some effort and energy to get really clear about what those things are.
I should clarify the record. I was not being flippant when I made that Coke Pepsi comment. In fact, Dr. Ralph Sarin has written an excellent paper talking about how these two approaches are not, in fact, diametrically imposed, but rather 2 points on a continuum, which we should really look at, not just those pathways into criminality, which the risk need responsivity model tends to focus on, but also those pathways out of criminality, which the emergent assistance approaches look at. So yeah, they can coexist.
Absolutely.
I have noticed kind of this strange double-edged sword amongst evidence-based practice champions. So let me pause and back up a little bit here. I had the honor last week of interviewing Dr. James Bonta. We talked all about risk need responsivity, the psychology of criminal conduct. And the week prior to that, I had the privilege of interviewing Brian Lovins, current head of APPA, president of APPA, but again, a great background. And Brian and I were talking about this point of sometimes the more progressive agencies, it's sort of a double-edged sword, like I said, if they get hyper vigilant around fidelity, but almost flying too close to the sun, if that makes sense. Brian noted that we have the principles of risk, need, and responsivity, but now we also talk about the fidelity principle. But he and I both were making observations about, again, folks get almost so hyper vigilant to fidelity that they don't see the forest from the trees and aren't open to other approaches. And I would contend I've seen this with motivational interviewing or other approaches. And it's great to have fidelity and passion, but it almost becomes this sort of strange my way or the highway approach, and not taking in the client's holistic experience. So I guess my question is, to what degree, again, does that sort of adherence to fidelity hamper us from being open to opposing views? And again, I could cite the R&R sort of good lives model debate going on versus let's just throw everything at the fridge. And I mean, obviously respect the research, but see where the future takes us.
I really appreciated in the newest manual from AIRN, from the Active Implementation Research Network, that they were really clear that straight replication is not effective, and that there should be opportunity to innovate. And so when you were talking, that's what came up for me, that I think because of our organizational culture types that are persistent in our field, we want to go all in, tell me all the things that need to happen. I'm going to create policies and practices and audits and things to make sure we get to some measure of fidelity, which I've also noticed people define that word in very different ways. And so we just we want to take something that works somewhere and pull it out as is, plunk it where we are, and be like, look at us, we did it, we're done, this thing is working. And I think that in those instances, fidelity becomes a problem for us. It probably becomes the thing that's going to be to our detriment, because we're trying to do fidelity to all sorts of things that may or may not fit. And because we're measuring that, we measure what matters. That's what people are going to do. And it's going to be really tough to hear people say, hey, I don't think this is working, or this doesn't quite work for us. And so again, from a similar lens, I would ask, fidelity to what? And there's a real opportunity, especially when we're trying new things, to get clear on what I would call non-negotiables. At ACJI, we talk a lot about non-negotiables. So two or three things that if we're doing these things, we can say that we're doing this innovation that we're trying, and leaving the rest of it open. I know it makes us scared to let people have some creative autonomy, but that's where a lot of the great ideas come from, the great opportunities to really tailor good ideas to fit our organizations, so that we know we have to do these three things to say that we're doing MI. But let's talk about how we can be creative with that. I mean, I still hear people say, MI is great and all, but sometimes you just have to arrest people. It's like, well, who's been talking to you about strategy? MI, there's strategy to the use of MI. It's not just throw everything else out that you do and only do MI. Sometimes when you try too hard, MI conversations can be really uncomfortable if they don't fit. And so I guess I would say that there's a real opportunity for us to get out of our own way, to get clear on the few things that we need to have fidelity to, and then leave the rest open to experimentation, trial and error, and innovation, because that's where all the good stuff comes from. The other piece that I think is missing for us around fidelity is that we don't normally step outside of ourselves to ask the people that we serve, how is this for you? What is the impact like for you? What could be better? And really using that feedback to adapt what we're doing in practice. And it's a real missing link for most agencies to get a sense of how people are experiencing them. And you can have the best shiny ideas ever and follow all the fidelity metrics that you want, but if people aren't experiencing in a way that they can hear it, feel it, benefit from it, it's not going to have the outcome that you want. And so I do think that fidelity gets in the way for us because we're trying to do all things really well. And that means that we're probably doing nothing super well.
When you mentioned audits in your reply, that triggered me a little bit.
I saw that.
Yeah, because it's to what end? And then also as you were speaking, I also thought of a new concept that I'm really warming to and going down the rabbit hole on, that of co-production. Again, like you said, involving the stakeholders, those with lived experiences, desisted individuals. Well, what worked for you? And again, let's co-produce a model or an approach together based on all of the above. Exactly.
Yeah, and if you don't want to use a parole board to do that, then you can certainly be talking to the people that you're serving. They know what's happening on the ground, and they can tell you very clearly, we spend a lot of time doing this, and this is not helpful at all. I'd much rather do this, and that would be much more helpful.
Yeah, when I had an active caseload back in the day, one of my favorite things to say to my clients was, hey, you're the expert of you. I've got lots of resources. I've got expertise in certain areas, but at the end of the day, you're the expert for you. You know that pathway out of criminality better than anybody does, certainly more than I do. So why would we not include that voice in the process?
I think that's really well said, Joe, and such an important piece for us. I know it sounds scary to some folks. I think that's why we've avoided it, but really there's such opportunity to learn about how we're impacting people in a much different way.
What else is on the horizon for Dr. Alex Walker? I shouldn't say if, when you're back on the show in a few years, what are we going to be chatting about, do you foresee?
Oh, Joe, I'd love to come back and talk with you and bring my team with me. I have such an amazing team. I think at the Alliance for Community and Justice Innovation, we're just really excited to be working with folks who are thinking about alignment. They're thinking about how to lead change in a different way, how to try something different. We have an academy, the one that you went to, but our virtual version coming up in January. And it's just really exciting to see how we've got professionals from across the country represented. And it's such a fun time to be able to talk to people and hear that we're all struggling with very similar things. And so I think on the horizon for us is to try to continue that work and really help people. we hear a lot from folks, I wish I would have had this 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And so we want to kind of break that and give it to people up front. We are working on a book, so that's kind of exciting. And, we're really excited to share some stories about how implementation can fall apart or actually work in really meaningful ways. And then I know that alignment is a big piece for me. That's the more I look at all of the science and everything, our biggest barrier is that we are often not aligned because we don't have a clear picture of where we're trying to go. And so I really am excited to do some more alignment work with folks and build on that, and some more public speaking. I really enjoy talking to folks, and I believe at my core that it takes a village, that we in the system, I'm making air quotes and I can't see it, but in the system cannot do this on our own. We need all hands on deck. We need different perspectives and different opportunities and different people at the table to really help us create a new vision, because we are a bit stuck in our blinders right now about what our system can and can't be. And so I'm hoping to inspire and engage folks who are, who maybe have never thought about the justice system, to get involved and share their ideas, because we really need everybody's help.
Yeah, I love that. And again, it aligns with what I was talking about earlier as far as this co-elevation piece. And like you said, involving everybody in the process. Dr. Alex Walker from the Alliance for Community and Justice Innovation, thank you so much. I look forward to the book coming out, and hopefully you and your team coming back on the show at some future date.
Thanks so much, Joe. It was a pleasure.
Always a treat when I get to talk to my friend Alex Walker, Director of Community Relations and Strategy for the Alliance for Community and Justice Innovation, ACJI, out in Denver, Colorado. I am going to pack in as many attachments and links as I can into the episode description of this program to highlight some of the things we talked about on the show, including the great article that Alex co-authored with Glenn Tapia, the Director of Leadership and Organizational Intelligence for ACJI, entitled The 10 Essential Principles of Implementation Leadership: Real-World Applications of Change Leadership Acumen. That was published in September of 2020 in Federal Probation Journal. Alex mentioned her fascinating work with the Colorado Parole Board, and so to that end, also going to include a link for an article she co-authored with Brandon Matthews and Edward Ryan entitled Awakening the Sleeping Giant: The Future of Paroling Authorities in America. I really think you're going to enjoy that read. I'm also going to include a short piece from our friends at ACJI entitled Impactful Implementation in Justice Settings: The Science Behind Measurable Results. I encourage everybody to please read that as well. And then, of course, I'm hoping I inspired some of you to reach out to ACJI for resources or ideally some upcoming trainings. I'm going to attach a flyer here talking about some offerings that they have coming up, including, of course, their fantastic 8-week Leadership Academy. They do this virtually now, so it doesn't matter if you're not in the Denver area. You can do this virtually. I've gone through both versions. They're both awesome. They also have a great People Workshop series coming up. As we know, people are an organization's most important asset, but do you have the right people? That is the question, with the right skills and support to achieve desired results. Take a look at their 4-week workshop, which does a deep dive into the people pillar, as they call it, of their 4 pillars of effective implementation. You've got to check that out and hopefully register for that as well. You heard Alex and I talking about the importance of leveraging data. They've got a great data workshop series coming up as well. That's a 4-week workshop. They'll give you tools and strategies to use data to make implementation decisions, really worth looking at as well. And of course, we talked about the fact that culture is king. They have a culture workshop series as well, which is fantastic. Organizational culture will eat your implementation strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They have a 4-week workshop which will equip your leadership with the knowledge and tools to create a culture hospitable to change. Please, please, please check out this and all other training offerings from our friends at ACJI, the Alliance for Community and Justice Innovation. Again, all of those cool links are right in the show notes of this episode. We will be back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, theparagongroup.llc.com, for training or presentations as to evidence-based practice, program design, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have any questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook page and our Instagram page at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. We are also on Twitter, The Criminologist Media Group, at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. Go ahead and give us a follow on Twitter. You can also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. Merchandise is now available. Reach out if interested. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us, ask them to subscribe to the podcast as well, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
And have lots of animals. So at any given time, we have dogs and cats and chickens and sometimes pigs and cows. And right now we have 68 fire mitigation goats, which is completely random. But that keeps me busy in my spare time.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.
The thoughts, statements, and opinions of the host and cast members do not necessarily reflect the views of their employers and are those of the host and cast themselves. Any discussion regarding client statements, behaviors, actions, or crimes are purely fictional and are used only for the purposes of example. Any examples that could be deemed to be related to an actual individual or individuals are incidental.